The courtroom was silent except for the sound of my own breathing, which seemed impossibly loud in my ears. I sat there, staring at the empty witness stand, my carefully crafted closing argument crumbling like sand through my fingers. For 23 years, I believed in the power of words, that the right phrase, the perfect argument, could move mountains, change minds, save lives. I was wrong. The jury had just delivered their verdict, guilty on all counts. My client, Maria Santos, a single mother of 3, would spend the next 15 years in prison for a crime I knew in my bones she didn't commit. The evidence was circumstantial, the prosecution's case full of holes I'd meticulously exposed. I delivered what I thought was the speech of my lifetime, passionate, logical, airtight. But none of it mattered. As the gavel fell, I felt something crack inside my chest. Not just disappointment. I'd lost cases before. This was different. This was the sound of my entire worldview shattering. Samuel, my mentor Professor Harrison, had told me during law school at Columbia, words are the most powerful tools we have. Master them, and you can change the world. I'd carried those words like a torch through every case, every argument, every late night spent crafting the perfect brief. Now, watching Maria's children cry in the gallery, I realized I'd been living in a beautiful delusion. The thing about being a criminal defense attorney is that you become addicted to the high of persuasion. Each successful argument feeds this deep hunger, the belief that you can reshape reality with nothing but language. I'd built my entire identity around this premise. Samuel Morrison, the guy who could talk anyone into anything, who could find the exact words to unlock any heart, convince any skeptic. But words, I was learning, were just vibrations in the air. They couldn't change facts. They couldn't overcome prejudice. They couldn't save an innocent woman from a system that had already decided her fate before she ever stepped into that courtroom. Walking out of the courthouse that day, I felt like I was floating, not in a good way, but like I'd lost my gravitational center. The humid Miami air stuck to my skin, and I could hear the distant sound of traffic, but everything felt muted, like I was experiencing life through thick glass. My phone buzzed with congratulations from colleagues who'd seen the news coverage but not the verdict. "Great job on the Santos case," one text read. Another, "Saw you on Channel 7. You killed it." They'd seen my performance, my passionate defense, but they hadn't seen the only thing that mattered, the failure. That night, I sat in my apartment overlooking Biscayne Bay, surrounded by law books and case files, and asked myself a question that terrified me. If words couldn't change everything, what was I? The weeks following Maria's conviction blurred together like watercolors in the rain. I threw myself into work with desperate intensity, taking on case after case, convinced that the next argument would restore my faith. If I could just find the right combination of words, the perfect emotional appeal, I could prove that language still mattered. I was drowning in my own expectations. Case after case, I watched my carefully constructed arguments fall flat. A teenager accused of armed robbery, I painted a picture of systemic poverty and lack of opportunity so vivid I could see jurors wiping their eyes. Guilty. An elderly man charged with tax evasion, I crafted a narrative of confusion and misunderstanding that seemed bulletproof. Guilty. A young mother caught with prescription drugs, I delivered a speech about addiction as disease that should have moved stone statues to tears. Guilty. Each verdict felt like a personal indictment, not just of my skills, but of my entire approach to life. My colleagues started avoiding me. I'd become the guy who ranted about the failure of communication during lunch breaks, who questioned whether any of us were actually making a difference. My assistant, Rosa, started screening my calls more carefully. "You're scaring the clients," she told me one Thursday morning, her voice gentle but firm. The breaking point came during a case involving a young artist named David Chun, accused of vandalizing a city mural. The evidence was clear. Security footage showed someone of his build spray painting over the artwork. But David swore he was trying to fix damage from earlier vandalism, not cause it. I prepared for weeks. I researched the psychology of artistic expression, the legal precedents around intent versus action, the cultural significance of public art. I interviewed art historians, community leaders, even the original mural artist. I built what I thought was an unassailable case. The night before closing arguments, I practiced my speech until 3 a.m. I could feel the power in the words, the way they built and flowed and crescendoed. This was it. This was the argument that would restore my faith in language, in justice, in myself. But as I stood before the jury the next morning, something strange happened. Mid-sentence, I stopped. Not because I forgot my words, but but because I suddenly saw the jurors' faces, really saw them. They weren't listening to my carefully crafted narrative about artistic intention and cultural preservation. They were looking at their phones, checking the clock, mentally already at lunch. I was talking to an empty room. That's when I realized the horrible truth. I'd been so focused on perfecting my words that I'd forgotten to consider whether anyone was actually hearing them. I'd become a skilled performer delivering soliloquies to an audience that had already left the theater. David was convicted. As he was led away, he looked back at me with something that wasn't anger, it was pity. He felt sorry for me, the lawyer who'd failed him so completely that he'd lost faith in his own profession. Walking home that night, I found myself in Bayfront Park, staring at the water. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, a professional communicator, and I couldn't even communicate with myself about what was happening to my life. I pulled out my phone and almost called my father. Dad had always been proud of his son, the lawyer, the man who fought for justice with words. But what would I tell him now? Made everyone in the shop go quiet. "I'm not looking for charity," the woman said, but her voice had already lost its edge. "It's not charity," the man replied, stepping past me to the counter. "It's Tuesday morning, and we're all trying to get through the day. Sometimes the universe gives us a chance to make someone else's day a little easier." He looked at the barista. Whatever she ordered, plus whatever she'd like to add to it. On me, the transformation was immediate. The woman's shoulders relaxed, her expression softened. That's very kind. But you don't have to." "I want to," he said simply. "Some days we all need a little grace." Within minutes, the crisis was over. The woman had her coffee, the barista was smiling again, and the line was moving. But I stood there, stunned. This stranger had done something I'd been trying to do for weeks. He'd actually reached someone. Not with perfectly crafted arguments or legal training, but with something else entirely. As we waited for our drinks, I found myself studying him. There was something about his presence that felt both commanding and gentle, like he was completely comfortable in his own skin. "That was impressive," I said, unable to resist striking up a conversation. He laughed, a warm sound that seemed to come from deep in his chest. 25 years of family law will teach you that most conflicts aren't really about what people say they're about. That woman wasn't angry about milk. She was angry about not being heard. "You're a lawyer?" "Carl Brennan," he said, extending his hand. "Criminal defense, mostly, though I've done my share of family court. What about you?" You had that look of someone about to launch into professional mediation mode. I introduced myself, and when I mentioned my own practice, his expression grew thoughtful. "Samuel Morrison? I've heard your name. You handled that Santos case recently, didn't you?" My stomach clenched. "Yes. We lost. I know. I was following it in the news." "Hell of a fight you put up." "Not hell enough, apparently." Carl was quiet for a moment, studying my face. "You know, there's a difference between fighting hard and fighting smart. Mind if I ask, what do you think went wrong?" It was a simple question, but something in the way he asked it made me pause. Not the usual lawyer-to-lawyer shop talk, but genuine curiosity. Standing there in that coffee shop, surrounded by the normal bustle of morning routine, I found myself telling a complete stranger about my crisis of faith. "I thought I could convince them," I said finally. "I thought if I just found the right words, presented the right argument, I could make them see the truth." Carl nodded slowly. "And how did that work out for you?" "Obviously, it didn't." "So what conclusion did you draw?" I almost said that words don't matter, but something in his expression stopped me. "That I was wrong about everything, I guess." "Or," Carl said, picking up his coffee as his name was called, "that you were asking the wrong question." Before I could respond, he was heading toward the door. But then he paused, turned back. "You know, I'm working on a case right now that might interest you. Young woman, similar situation to Santos. If you're free this afternoon, maybe we could talk." He handed me his card. "My office is in Coral Gables. 2 o'clock. I stared at the card as he walked away, my mind racing. I had no idea what he meant about asking the wrong question, but something about the way he'd handled that coffee shop situation, the way he'd actually connected with someone instead of just talking at them, made me want to find out. Carl's office was nothing like I'd expected. Instead of the usual lawyer decor, diplomas, awards, intimidating law books, his walls were covered with photographs. Families, couples, children. People smiling, hugging, looking genuinely happy. "Those are my real victories," he said, noticing my attention. "Not the cases I won, but the lives that got better because of the work we did together." He gestured to a chair across from his desk, which was cluttered with files, coffee cups, and what looked like a half-finished crossword puzzle. "So," he said, leaning back in his chair, "tell me about the Santos case. Not the legal strategy, the story." For the next hour, I found myself recounting not just the facts of the case, but my own journey through it. Carl listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding or asking a clarifying question. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "Samuel," he said finally, "I want to share something with you." Back in 2019, researchers at Stanford did a fascinating study on persuasion. They followed 1,200 people involved in various legal proceedings and measured not just case outcomes, but participant satisfaction and long-term impacts. He pulled out a worn notebook, flipping through pages covered in his handwriting. What they found was counterintuitive. The lawyers who were most successful at actually changing people's minds, not just winning cases, but creating lasting transformation, weren't the ones with the most eloquent arguments. They were the ones who spent the most time listening. Listening. The study showed that effective persuasion isn't about finding the right words to say. It's about finding the right questions to ask. The lawyers who created real change were the ones who understood that communication is a two-way street. Carl stood up, walking to a whiteboard covered in what looked like case notes. "Here's what I think happened with Santos. You prepared a brilliant argument, but you prepared it in isolation. You crafted your message based on what you thought the jury needed to hear, not on what they were actually ready to receive." He drew a simple diagram. Two circles, one labeled "what I want to say" and another labeled "what they need to hear." Most lawyers focus on the first circle. Great lawyers find the intersection. But how do you find that intersection? I asked. By changing the fundamental question. Instead of asking, "How can I convince them?" you start asking, "What do they need to understand? And what's preventing them from understanding it?" Carl sat back down, his expression growing more serious. "There's a researcher at the University of Toronto, Dr. Patricia Chun, who's done groundbreaking work on what she calls cognitive empathy in persuasion. She found that people resist arguments not because they're illogical, but because they feel unheard or misunderstood. So what do you do about that? You listen first. You validate their existing beliefs before you challenge them. You make them feel seen and understood before you ask them to see something new." Carl opened a file on his desk. The case I mentioned, Nina Rodriguez, 22 years old, charged with assault after getting into a fight outside a nightclub. The prosecution's case is that she started it. She says she was defending herself from harassment. He slid a photograph across the desk. A young Latina woman with kind eyes and a worried expression. Traditional approach would be to build a case around self-defense, right? Character witnesses, expert testimony about fear response, maybe some statistics about violence against women. That's exactly what I'd do. And you'd probably lose. Because the jury would see a young woman in a nightclub fight and make assumptions based on their existing beliefs about personal responsibility and conflict resolution. Carl leaned forward. But what if, instead of fighting their assumptions, we first acknowledge them? What if we started by agreeing that violence is never the ideal solution, that everyone wishes this situation had been handled differently? I could see where he was going, but it still felt counterintuitive. Wouldn't that weaken your case? Dr. Chin's research says no. She found that when people feel their core beliefs are respected rather than attacked, they become more open to new information. It's like Carl paused, searching for an analogy. It's like trying to change someone's mind is like trying to get them to open a door. You can keep pushing harder and harder, but if they're pulling from the other side, you'll never get through. But if you first acknowledge why they're pulling, why their position makes sense to them, they'll often let go of the handle. Over the next 2 hours, Carl walked me through his approach to the Rodriguez case. Instead of building a traditional defense, he was planning to start with validation, acknowledging the jury's natural concerns about nightclub violence and personal responsibility. Only then would he introduce the evidence of harassment, the witness statements, the context that changed everything. But what if they just agree with your opening statements and tune out the rest? I asked. Carl smiled. That's where the story comes in. Once you've earned their trust by showing you understand their perspective, you can guide them through a narrative that gradually shifts their understanding. It's not about overwhelming them with facts. It's about creating an emotional journey that leads them to a new conclusion. As I left his office that day, my head was spinning. Everything Carl had said made logical sense, but it required a fundamental shift in how I approached my work. Instead of being a master performer delivering monologues, I needed to become a facilitator of understanding. The next morning, I called Carl and asked if I could observe the Rodriguez case. "I want to see this in action," I told him. "Even better," he said. "I could use a co-counsel. If you're willing to learn a new way of practicing law." For the first time in months, I felt something I'd almost forgotten: hope. The Rodriguez trial began 3 weeks later, and I watched Carl work with the fascination of someone discovering a new language. During jury selection, instead of looking for people who might be sympathetic to our client, he asked questions designed to understand how potential jurors processed conflict and made decisions about personal responsibility. When you see a news story about a fight, he asked one potential juror, "What's the first thing you find yourself wondering about?" "I guess, what led up to it," the woman replied. "Like, what made it get to that point?" "That's interesting. So you believe context matters when judging someone's actions?" "Absolutely. Things aren't usually as simple as they seem." That's when I understood what Carl meant about finding the intersection. He wasn't looking for jurors who would automatically side with us. He was looking for people who were naturally curious about the full story. His opening statement was unlike anything I'd ever heard in a courtroom. Instead of starting with Nina's innocence or the prosecution's weaknesses, he began with something that seemed to support their case. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want to start by acknowledging something we can all agree on. Violence is never the ideal solution to any problem. When we hear about fights outside nightclubs, our natural reaction is to wonder why the people involved couldn't have found another way to handle their disagreement." I watched the jury's body language shift. Instead of the defensive postures I was used to seeing, arms crossed, skeptical expressions, they were leaning forward, nodding slightly. Carl had just validated their existing beliefs, and they were curious about where he was going next. "That's exactly what I thought when I first heard about this case," he continued. "Why didn't Nina Rodriguez just walk away? Why didn't she ask for help? Why didn't she try to de-escalate the situation?" Now he had their full attention. They were wondering the same things. And then I learned something that changed my entire understanding of what happened that night. Something that I think will change yours too. What followed wasn't a traditional legal argument. It was a story. Carl guided the jury through Nina's evening step by step, helping them understand her perspective without dismissing their concerns about violence. He showed them how she had tried to walk away, how she had asked for help, how she had attempted to de-escalate. But he did it in a way that made the jury feel like they were discovering these facts themselves, rather than being lectured about them. During the prosecution's case, Carl's cross-examinations were revelatory. Instead of attacking the witness's credibility, he asked questions that helped them tell a fuller story. When the bouncer testified that he'd seen Nina throw the first punch, Carl didn't dispute it. Instead, he asked about what the bouncer had seen in the moments before, the aggressive behavior from the other group, Nina's attempts to leave, the escalating harassment. "So when you saw Nina raise her fist," Carl asked, "what was happening to her at that exact moment?" "Well, that guy Marcus had grabbed her arm. He was pulling her toward him, and she was trying to get away." And in your experience working in nightclub security, when someone is being physically restrained against their will, what do you typically see happen next? They usually try to get free. Sometimes they have to fight to get free. Carl never once used the phrase self-defense. He didn't need to. The jury was reaching the conclusion themselves. But the real breakthrough came when Carl called his final witness, not an expert or a character witness, but Nina herself. And instead of having her testify about what happened that night, he asked her to talk about what she learned from the experience. "Nina," he said, "if you could go back to that night, knowing what you know now, what would you do differently?" It was a question that could have destroyed our case. Any answer might suggest she'd done something wrong. But Carl had prepared her for this moment. "I would have trusted my instincts earlier," Nina said, her voice steady but emotional. "When that group first started bothering me and my friends, I felt uncomfortable, but I didn't want to cause a scene. I kept thinking maybe I was overreacting. Maybe they were just being friendly. Now I know that when someone makes you feel unsafe, you don't have to be polite about protecting yourself." The jury was completely engaged now. This wasn't just about one night outside a nightclub, it was about a universal human experience. The fear of being impolite, the difficulty of trusting your own instincts, the challenge of setting boundaries. "And what would you tell other young women who might find themselves in a similar situation?" Carl asked. "That your safety matters more than other people's comfort. That you don't have to smile and be nice to someone who's making you feel threatened. And that sometimes protecting yourself means doing things you wish you didn't have to do." The prosecution's closing argument was technically sound, but it felt hollow after what the jury had just experienced. They tried to refocus on the legal technicalities, the burden of proof, the importance of not excusing violence. But Carl had already guided the jury to a place where they understood the difference between excuse and explanation. Carl's closing was brief. 3 weeks ago, I asked you to think about context when judging someone's actions. You've now heard the full context of what happened that night. You've heard from every witness, seen every piece of evidence, and most importantly, you've heard from Nina herself about what she learned from this experience. He paused, looking at each juror individually. The question isn't whether Nina Rodriguez made a perfect decision that night. The question is whether she made a reasonable decision given the circumstances she was facing. And I believe, based on everything you've heard, that you already know the answer to that question. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. Not guilty on all counts. But the real victory wasn't the verdict, it was what happened afterward. As we left the courthouse, I turned to Carl and said, I finally understand what you meant about asking the wrong question. Oh, I was asking how to convince people I was right. But the real question is how to help people discover the truth for themselves. Carl smiled. That's the thing about communication, Samuel. It's not about transmission, it's about transformation. When you stop trying to change minds and start trying to open them, everything changes. 6 months later, my practice had transformed completely. I wasn't winning more cases, I was winning better cases. More importantly, I was creating outcomes that actually served my clients' long-term interests. The Rodriguez case had taught me that effective advocacy wasn't about perfect arguments, it was about perfect understanding. Last week, I got a letter from Maria Santos. She'd been granted a new trial based on newly discovered evidence, and she wanted me to represent her again. But this time, I wouldn't be trying to convince a jury that she was innocent. I'd be helping them understand why the evidence led to that conclusion. The letter ended with a line that I've read probably 50 times. I don't know what happened to you since my first trial, but whatever it was, I'm grateful. You sound like someone who finally learned how to listen. She was right. I had learned to listen. And in learning to listen, I'd rediscovered something I thought I'd lost forever. The power of words to change everything. Not because they could force change, but because they could invite it. The truth is, words can change everything. I just had to learn that they do it not by pushing people toward new ideas, but by creating space for new ideas to emerge. That's the difference between speaking and communicating, between arguing and advocating, between performing and connecting. And that's a lesson I wish I could go back and teach my younger self. The most powerful words aren't the ones that impress people with your brilliance. They're the ones that help people discover their own.